Hey, welcome to the For Evansville podcast, a podcast about learning the needs and dreams of our city so that we can make it a place where everyone can flourish. We don't want to just be in Evansville, we want to be for Evansville. And today we're really excited because we have a big announcement to make, which is that we are releasing the updated State of E report, which is a really good opportunity to do what this podcast seeks to do, to learn the needs and dreams of the city. And so our guest today is John Benton, who did all of the heavy lifting of compiling different data and research and kind of combing through that and putting it together in a format that's easy to read and understand and kind of focus in on some specific areas. And then I'm also here with Adrian,
Hello.
And we're excited to dive into this data and have just a little bit of a conversation about how looking at this high-level view can be helpful for engaging in the city. So
our last State of E was in 2019, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So now we've had updated data. And John, you were a part of that originally too. Can you tell us why we've asked you to do it? Do you know why?
Why me?
Yeah, why you?
Golly. Feels like that was a regretful question. Well, the story for me was actually in late 2018. I had lunch with Ross, maybe it was coffee with Ross, that doesn't matter, where we were talking about what does a report on our city look like that helps Christians, your average Evansville citizen, understand the undercurrent of what's happening and what are the major trends in our city. And I think the reason he and I were having that discussion was because that's something I'm very passionate about. I care a lot about in the work that I do in my day-to-day profession, working at Dream Center Evansville, is exegeting, understanding, interpreting a specific neighborhood, understanding what are people facing on a regular basis and what's going on. And as I've sought to do that, I've realized, what's going on in the neighborhood that I've been placed in, it's not really isolated to just that neighborhood. There's distinguishing factors across many spaces in Evansville, but no one was really at that time asking the question, how do we begin to really understand Evansville broadly in a way that the church can digest? And so it just seemed like there was some cool overlap with the things I did regularly in my profession, some heart interests that I had, and just love for the way, at the time, I think for Evansville was just Jonathan and Ross, and just the way those two, and now what for Evansville has become, we're processing how do we mobilize and move the church towards action. And so I think that's what brought me to the table. I think Ross was just out to lunch whenever he asked me to do it, so I have no clue. And then he asked me again.
And figuratively?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
So no clue why he asked me a second time, but it tricks on him.
yeah, well, I think we would say it's because you did such a great job on the first one, and we were excited to have you back for the second one. And whenever we first had the idea to do this report, I think it made a lot of sense to ask you because of how data informed your work has been at the Dream Center. And one of the things that I appreciate about that is you guys look at the numbers and the research and you collect data on like a high level like that, but you also do a lot of knocking on doors and asking questions and getting to know the people that you serve. And so being able to have both of those things, this high level perspective and what do the numbers tell me, and also to have that in-person perspective of, what does this person who I know and trust and have a relationship tell me, I think is really valuable and reflective of what we would like to see for Evansville as an organization reflect, but also anybody who engages with the report, whether they're part of a local church or a nonprofit or a business leader or just somebody who lives in Evansville. This helps you see a big picture perspective of what are the needs that our city is facing, and specifically with the 5 areas that we've identified, what are some opportunities that I might have to serve my neighbors really well and to help them flourish. So
part of our State of E, like you just mentioned, is the 5 areas that we've identified as big overarching problem areas. So I'm just going to say those really quick so we just have a quick overview. Neighborhood and household well-being, child welfare, mental wellness, racial unity, and job quality. So either one of you want to speak into how did we get to those 5?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that. So when we first originally did this in 2019, we actually had this fun idea that we were not going to eventually execute on, but what would it be like if we could take the statement "E is for everyone" and ask, so like, is there like a percentage that E is for everyone?
Yeah. How for everyone is E?
Yeah. Because I don't think that the heart behind E is for everyone is that, we're going to ignore the fact that there are people who life isn't quite the same for them as it is for others. And really what we're talking about here is we don't live in a city that has perfect equity, perfect equality, or anything like that. And so as we endeavored on that, we realized maybe that's just not the right way to frame something like this. Mm-hmm. So what would it look like if instead we looked at what are like the really important conditions underneath equity at a city level? And so in our first edition, some of the metrics were different. Some of them were the same. I think for the most part, they're same. Neighborhood and household well-being was actually affordable housing in the first report, and we updated that for neighborhood and household well-being. Because affordable housing, while it's such an important issue, it is maybe the symptom or component of a broader topic, which is, again, neighborhood and household well-being. But those really came from a place of trying to understand what conditions at a city level constitute high-level E is for everyone.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I like that a lot because a lot of times that idea and a lot of the sort of driving vision behind For Evansville can feel very abstract. You know, it's very philosophical or just kind of this ambiguous ideal. And this report helps it become a little more tangible. And it says, what are we really talking about when we say that we want our city to be a place where everyone can flourish? What are some of the significant barriers that keep somebody from flourishing? And what are the areas of opportunity? That's the language that we've used this time around. Areas of opportunity to help somebody flourish or empower somebody to flourish in our community. And so it gives us some big areas to look at. And it was interesting as we were working on you had presented the data this time around to us, and we were working on kind of the publication of the report. And I, at the same time, in my personal life, was building a relationship with a young man who I had met at church, and he was in foster care at the time, and just a really great young man who became friends with us and friends with our kids and spent a lot of time in our home and stuff. And around the time that we were working on this report, he aged out of foster care and ended up in a situation where he was really kind of facing a lot of challenges in 4 of these 5 areas. And it was really enlightening to me because I began to realize, first of all, how interconnected a lot of these things are, but also the fact that in each of these areas, we're really talking about people that you and I know and interact with on a regular basis. And that made this report much more valuable to me. Not that it wasn't before, of course, but all of a sudden it was like, okay, I have a little bit of a framework to think about what are the ways that, not necessarily that I can help this person, but what are the areas that he needs to get connected to supports and resources that exist in our community. And that's been like an ongoing thing. And his resilience through that and his optimism through that, and his ability to still smile and have fun in the midst of those challenges has been really inspiring and encouraging to me. But it's also been inspiring to see how different pieces of the solution have kind of come together in his life specifically. So I'd be curious to hear from you guys as you look through the report and you think about these 5 areas. Have you had similar interactions where you can kind of see how these areas overlap with the lives of people, and maybe that makes them feel a little bit less overwhelming or a little bit more like, this is something I can engage with, like there's some information in this report that's like, whew, man,
yeah.
I don't know who's going to fix that, but it's not going to, I don't know where to start. But then whenever it's a person and it's somebody and you care about, it's like, what can I do for that person? And how can the community come around them, Right.
I think the report, it's a bunch of, just kind of my impression of it is like a bunch of numbers and data. And then when you came in, actually presented it to us, I went home and cried because I was like,
people are always crying after I interact. So it's like, that's fine.
Because it is, you just start thinking like, these are people. When we talk about these high level ideas of all of this, but then once you connect them and kind of create this story that you were helping paint, you realize, and then even with your friend just walking through that and hitting these points, you just realize it's really hard sometimes when you are, in these things, when you don't have stable housing and you need childcare, and childcare is really unaffordable or even unavailable. And then you see, well, then there's not transportation to even get there, and there's not good jobs to pay for that childcare. And it's like, seems like this endless cycle. And so it's really helped me kind of empathize, but also think, what can I do? Where's my space that I should fit in to try to at least help one thing so that somebody can get at least a little bit of a hand up, or, it's the data for me is not data anymore. And we've been talking about this a lot, is that Evansville is this more of an ecosystem of neighbors. It is people that we're talking about, not just numbers. And just seeing that, like, my well-being is also related to the well-being of my neighbors. When our neighbors aren't doing well, we don't do well. And, I think even a very visual way was when we had that storm a couple weeks ago or last week. There's these huge trees falling in our street. And it was just amazing to see how everyone came outside, immediately started chopping up this tree because it was on somebody's car and it was blocked the street, and it was just kind of like a metaphor of this. It's like, if we see this huge problem in our way and somebody's suffering, we should all just come out and, what can we do to fix that? So,
right.
Yeah, I just feel like I've been going on a journey with this data myself.
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying too that, the report in and of itself, we tried to focus on where are the needs and where are the gaps. So it would be easy to look at this report and get the impression like, oh man, this doesn't paint a very good picture of our city. We tried to also include in the report this time around some positive stories of like, hey, here's an example of how people are coming together to meet this need. And hopefully in the podcast over the next several months, we'll have the opportunity to do more of that in person and as we talk to people, because the reality is in all of these areas where there are significant needs, there are already people who are stepping up and sort of like, to borrow your analogy, like coming out after the storm and firing up the chainsaw and beginning to do the heavy lifting and working together. And to me, that's really, really inspiring. So whenever I look at this report and I see these opportunities, it doesn't feel discouraging to me. It feels empowering and inspiring, I think, because I personally have had the opportunity to meet a lot of people working in these spaces. And that's just been really great. And it makes me want to invest more in these spaces and like find where do I fit in that story of rebuilding and cleaning things up and serving and loving my neighbor. And so, I think that's pretty cool.
I think you said something. It's really. I don't quite remember the original question, but I'm going to try to respond to some ideas
Sure,
that come here and here. Which is, I love that you use the phrase ecosystem. Because whenever I engage with this data, and after 6 months of interfacing with this amount of information, you start to feel like dehumanized in it. So it's interesting. There's a particular number in this report that this small sample report that it's burdened me basically all year because in our ecosystem, we see a gap between individuals that live in some of our most affluent neighborhoods in comparison to our most impoverished neighborhoods. And that gap is not just a wealth gap.
Right.
That gap actually has to do with the one thing that we all know we have, which is the days of our lives. Not the show. The days of our lives are something we actually all can say is a commonality. We all wake up in the morning and we all go to bed at night. Right. What happens in the meantime, obviously, there's a lot of disparity as well. But the major disparity is how many of those days we actually get in comparison to those in the wealthier neighborhoods versus the impoverished neighborhoods. In fact, the gap is 23 and a half years. If I live in the wealthiest neighborhood in Evansville, on average, I'm going to live 23 and a half years longer than my neighbor that lives in the lowest income neighborhood.
That is crazy. It's really crazy.
It's discouraging, to say the least. And when I thought about like some of those like personal examples, one that was visceral for me, I won't say any names here, but there's a Dream Center mom. At Dream Center, we work really hard to have deep relationships with families and kids. And one mom we got to know, she actually, someone who actually is a part of a local church here in Evansville, had been so for a long time, through COVID, got very shut in and had multiple health diagnoses that were being neglected, the response or the interventions that she needed. She was neglecting to respond to those. And I want to say 36. At the age of 36, she actually lost her life in related to some cardiovascular issues. 36, due to diet and exercise-related issues, leaves behind multiple children. And I look at this story and I think, okay, she's not actually the only one I know like this. Because my first 2 months at the Dream Center, I interacted with a guy and his son. Son's coming to after-school program, getting to know Dad. Dad is actually only 3 days older than me. And after 2 months of getting to know Dad and son, the dad dies. Dad actually has a allergic reaction to a pill that he takes. He was abusing this pill and had been infused with some other things that his body wasn't prepared for, and because he was not under the guidance of a healthcare professional, he lost his life, leaving behind this little 4-year-old boy and 6-year-old girl at the time. And I think, wait, those aren't the only stories I know. I just get flooded with these stories, and the reason I think we do the State of E report is you don't get an average like 23 years without a weight of people having this experience after experience. And if you could begin to just spend time in these places where the disparities are occurring, you're going to run into those stories. And you're not going to just run into one or two. You're going to run into many stories. Yeah. I feel like I could probably sit here and list those stories for the whole time we're together, unfortunately. And that's what kind of comes forward whenever you do this report is someone who has the blessing and the challenge of working in the neighborhood where most of these disparities are occurring, one of the neighborhoods, you just get to the point where you just are aware of, I am aware of that indicator, and I can put a face to it really quickly, and unfortunately I can put multiple faces. That's sort of like the power of a report like this, that it for me, it puts actually a number on the faces I see.
Yeah.
Whereas I think for many, we're trying to begin to create the translation of put faces to the numbers that we're revealing.
Yeah. Well, and I think that statistic specifically is maybe one of the most overwhelming things that's presented in the report. And it feels like a punch to the gut almost. It feels like that's really discouraging. And I think we have to acknowledge that as human beings, we have this automatic reaction that happens when we encounter information that is hard to hear or hard to process. And that's that we want to put it out of our minds. You know, that cognitive dissonance kicks in, and it's like, I'm going to put distance between myself and that knowledge. And I'm going to try to protect myself from the way that I feel whenever I hear that. And I would just encourage anybody who reads the report or anybody who's listening to this episode to embrace the way that you feel when you hear that news, and to not allow yourself to put distance between that story and that information and yourself. Because I think that it's in that closeness and it's in that embracing that discomfort that we begin to change into the types of neighbors that we need to be to make that not a reality anymore. That, you know, that's the essence of compassion, right? The word compassion in its most rudimentary form means with suffering. So to enter into the suffering of somebody else, to feel that pain and to, in a sense, feel that despair, but to do it in a way that can empower us to action, that can motivate us to step into those things. And I think it can be intimidating to think about stepping into those things because it feels like we don't have the power to change that. You know, it's if you ask me, how are you gonna change that number, Jonathan? You know, how are you going to make that not a reality in your city? I couldn't come up with a plan for you, but I will say that in the same way that we talked about our city as an ecosystem, we know that it's an ecosystem that we all participate in and that we contribute to on a daily basis. And so we do have some amount of power and influence over the city that we're a part of and the ecosystem that we're a part of. And none of us have the whole solution, but I think we all have a piece of it. And so as you read this report, as you engage with this data, my encouragement to our listeners would be to recognize that this is looking at the big picture, and that the action that we would hope you would take is to say, what's the small little piece that I can play in that big picture? And to recognize, like, you know, you're probably not going to tackle one of these areas completely, but that you probably have a neighbor who's affected in some way by one of these areas. And you do have some kind of opportunity to impact it. And it's just a matter of discovering what that opportunity might be.
Yeah, it made me think of one of our shirts. I guess I'll shamelessly plug one of our t-shirts that says creator, consumer, and like consumers crossed out.
Right. Yeah.
And it made me think that, you know, whenever I see data like this or hear people pushing data to change, I think like, okay, who is doing the work? How can I go and volunteer there? And while I think sometimes when you do run into those very specific stories, you think, okay, yeah, I need to plug into a group or a place that is doing that and I want to work there. That totally happens and it's awesome because they need more volunteers. But I also feel like there's a place where we need to be creative in the spaces that we are already in. Like even just businesses, they can easily tap into the job quality thing.
Sure.
But also they can be very creative in affecting these other things as well. And I think our report is doing a good job of pointing those out, but we also have some good quotes of, we asked, you know, somebody at Community One, hey, what kind of job can, like, or what kind of business can affect housing, stable housing? And the jobs that he was listing off is like any type of business actually can.
Right.
If you're just creative enough and thinking of those things. And so just because where you are might not affect those, it actually probably could. So it just takes creative thinking on our behalf.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's also a value in thinking about how we work together in these areas. It feels safe and manageable to focus on what's the thing that I have control over changing. What's the change that I can control as I produce good in our community. And that's really valuable. I hope that we all have an awareness of here's the unique contribution that I can make to our city. But whenever we allow ourselves to sit with the uncomfortable data that we don't feel like we can control, I think it drives us to say, how does my little contribution that I feel really good about, how does it fit together with some of the other things? Because as a business owner or something, or a leader, or even just an employee or a neighbor, it might feel like there's a very small contribution that I can make. But if you see how that fits together with maybe what other people are doing, then you can begin to create alignment that I think moves the needle in some of these areas in a really cool way.
I think the thing that is always so difficult to wrap our heads around, especially as we are kind of coming out of I would say in the early 2000s, for those of us who were in the church world, mainly youth group, every message you ever got about being an example of Christ or loving your neighbor was wide or a whole scale, you're going to go feed 5,000. And frankly, that's not practical ministry. If you want to just get technical, practical ministry is what Jesus really taught, which was he rarely had parables about teaching 5,000. I can't think of one, actually, unless he was the one doing the work. His parables were very interpersonal, very one-to-one, and that's something that I think we can feel insecure about, or we feel like the starfish effect is a problem. The fact of the matter is that starfish was really happy you throw him back in the ocean, right? And when I think about any one of these issues, they're very intersectional issues, they're very ecosystem-driven, and we want to say things like, I want to solve that problem. And we almost kind of get discouraged when we don't feel like we have a way to solve that problem. But the fact of the matter is the stories that Jesus shared rarely solve the social issue. They were usually focusing on where his heart was at, which was that he loves each of us individually, and he was willing to engage with an issue one person at a time. And so it's okay to engage with one issue at a time. It's also okay to try to feed the 5,000, but the idea that you ever are inhibited by the feeling that you're not going to have the type of impact you wish you could have on a number, you're missing out on the opportunity to do what Jesus did himself, which was he did interpersonal ministry one person at a time. And that one person can be the person that goes after 4 or 5 after you. Multiplication can happen 1 times 1 in the kingdom of God. It's a really cool effect. And it's how a lot of neighborhood workers are, in our region especially, focusing in their work. You might think that they are trying to feed the 5,000. Well, no, most of our neighborhood activities are one relationship at a time, one challenge at a time, one day at a time.
Right. And I think that kind of goes back to what I said about why we really thought you had a good perspective to pull this report together, because you had that high-level perspective, but also the interpersonal one-on-one relationship kind of perspective. And I think the work that you guys do at Dream Center is a really good sort of marriage of those two things, that you look at the whole picture, the whole scope of everything, but you also look at individual. And I think that just gives you a really good perspective. So, another takeaway I think from this report is don't just read this report and then think that that's sufficient information. It's kind of a starting point, a jumping off point. And if you start there, I would say the next thing to do is to go be with people and get to know them. And if one data point or one of these areas sticks out to you more than another, then that gives you maybe a direction to start doing some more in-person not investigation, because it's not about, going and learning the information. It's about being with the people who are affected by that data point, and learning from them, having an openness and a humility to learn and to say, I want to understand this better. So,
Yeah.
And recognizing too, Jonathan, when we look at data like this, it's fair to say that these conditions in our ecosystem as a city, they tend to be the things that are underpinning this big social problem that we call poverty. Any one of the five that we're talking about, and that's neighborhood and household well-being, child welfare, racial unity, mental wellness, and job quality.
right.
They tend to contribute to this condition of poverty. And why I think that's important is there's this really excellent resource that comes out of the Chalmers Center Institute. They won't mind me getting the last part wrong. There's sort of this Christian think tank that processes how to do philanthropy well without hurting those in which you're trying to reach with philanthropy. And one of the really salient ideas that come forward from them is that there's different types of poverty. And so when you see these conditions, we're really talking about what are, in some ways, material poverty and social poverty, but those things are not just being contributed from social, or rather material issues.
Sure.
Actually, there's another type of poverty that Chalmers has discovered, which is this sort of relational, spiritual, and self-poverty. It's this poverty that maybe I'm poor in my relationships, maybe I'm poor in my connection to God, or maybe I'm poor in my relationship to creation. And we all kind of carry these different conditions. And as you said, if my neighbor's not doing well, that affects me. And if I'm not doing well, that affects my neighbor. Whenever I carry in non-material poverty, I bring that to work with me sometimes. If I don't have good relationships with others, maybe I'm going to be a jerk at work, and I'm going to do a bad job hanging up drywall. And maybe because I was being a jerk that day and I didn't put up drywall up right, it's going to cause mold to form in a house. And maybe because that mold formed in a house, a child gets sick. And maybe because the child got sick, parent loses out on hours at work. And maybe because of that, they lost income and it made it harder to pay bills. And now the kid is having even more difficulty getting to class, and that affects their education. You can see that these rippling effects, I mean, who in their mind would have ever thought a journeyman could affect a child's grades?
Yeah.
Well, we're finding that they do. And we're finding that we intersect with one another way more than we can ever consider. And so if we don't address our own poverty, we're really not serving this data well. So I think it's more than just seeing those in material poverty. It's engaging with them in such a way that we also come to the room and say, I'm bringing my own poverty to the room. And so we all need to become a little bit more whole and a little bit more healed.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
That's great.
I think that's great. Yeah. And I think that's a great way to wrap it up. And Adrian, do you have any final thoughts on State of E or this conversation?
I feel like we could talk about this all day, but I feel like I'm really looking forward to the next, I want to say season, but it's not literally a new season of our podcast, but just this
the last
next
half of this season
era of our podcast. Yeah, where we just dive into each one of these, and the stories will come out, the inspirational ones or the hard to hear ones. So I'm looking forward to that. So keep listening. Yeah,
me too. Yeah, be sure to listen. Download the State of E report at forevansville.org/State of E. And then if you have any questions or comments or stories as you comb through that data, we would love to hear from you and maybe feature some of those as parts of our conversations over the next several months as we talk to people who are working in each of these areas. So get in touch with us through email at connect@forevansville.org, or leave us a comment or a message on Instagram and Facebook at forevansville.
Also in the show notes, I'll put this in. So we have a poster of the 5 areas to help your neighbors flourish. You can print that out and hang it up in your office or business or even at your house. So that's there for you as well.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.